All right. Looks like we are ready to get started, but feel free to keep trickling in. So thanks so much for joining us. This is the Farm Bill Basics panel. So we'll be talking all things Farm Bill, forestry, ag, ranching policy, all of that good stuff. Of course, we've got two secondary asks that we'll touch on as well throughout this, but I've got two really esteemed panelists here with us who are going to talk to us a bit about the Farm Bill and their experience working on it and what's going on currently in Congress. So I'll introduce both of them right here at the start. So Maya Solomon to my left is the American Forest Foundation Senior Director of Policy and Advocacy. Before joining AFF, Maya worked for over 15 years for the U.S. Forest Service. She oversaw a number of grant programs, acted as the National Budget Coordinator, and worked on multiple farm bills. So this is going to be our resident expert of someone who's been through this process before and can help shepherd us through. And at AFF, she oversees the organization's advocacy efforts to support conservation programs for family forest owners. So we'll get some good questions in there on forestry, especially those of you in some districts who have forest lands and things like that. I think it'll be really insightful. And then furthest from me, Morgan Brummund is the Government Affairs Director for the American Conservation Coalition, ACC, who I'm sure a bunch of you are familiar with. And she leads ACC's congressional advocacy on environmental and climate solutions, including their efforts on natural climate solutions. So she knows exactly what we're going to get into on the Hill, lobbying, talking to our members of Congress, how to resonate with them. Before joining ACC, Morgan worked for the Department of Energy, supporting their strategic planning and investments in energy efficiency and renewable energy. And prior to that, she worked as an energy policy analyst at the Idaho Governor's Office of Energy and Mineral Resources. So please join me in welcoming our two esteemed panelists. All right, so before we dive into the weeds, because I know we're all so eager to learn about this incredibly complicated bill, I would love to give each of you a chance to just do some opening remarks and some background.
Yeah. Thank you so much for the wonderful introduction. And since you all have heard about me personally, I think I'll spend my introduction time talking about the American Forest Foundation, just so that you can have a little bit of level set of the organization that I represent. The American Forest Foundation has been in existence for over 80 years, and its flagship program is called the Tree Farm program, where our family forest owners enter into a sustainable management program that allows them to sell their products from off of their lands for it's called SFI, it's called accrediting program. So they essentially, they're selling wood that is of a higher caliber. About 3 years ago, the American Forest Foundation decided to make a shift into the voluntary carbon markets and launched the Family Forest Carbon Program. One of the things that we saw is that while our family forest owners were struggling to keep up with invasive species and maintaining biodiversity, all because of all of the climate shifts that they've been experiencing in their different geographical areas, that we needed to attack the climate change issue. And so we made a conscious effort to make a shift from, we still focus on wildfire initiative, we still have biodiversity, but at the forefront of that priority is how do we combat climate change through natural climate solutions and nature-based solutions. And so through our partnership with the TNC, as I mentioned, we launched the Family Forest Carbon Program. We initially started in the Appalachian Mountains, and now Appalachian areas rather, now we have expanded to over 11 states where we have landowners enrolled. We aggregate the small landowners into a project area. If you all are familiar with the voluntary carbon market, specifically for forest products, or forestry, they tend to favor the larger forest owners that own thousands of acres and up. So we are the only organization that's aggregating small landowners from 10 acres on up into viable voluntary carbon markets. We are in the work, we are working with Vera and other quasi-government standard bodies to ensure that the projects that we produce are truly adding additionality and truly are resolving our climate crisis. So that's a little bit about American Forest Foundation, and happy to address any questions when we get to the Q&A period about the organization.
All right, hopefully y'all can hear me. I'm mic'd up, but it's moving. Hi all, wonderful to see you today ahead of your lobby day tomorrow. So I'll also just use this time to kind of chat through ACC and our approach to the Farm Bill in particular. So if you're familiar, which I'm sure a few of you are, we've really enjoyed working with CCL advocates on the ground across the country. But ACC, to summarize, is the largest right-of-center grassroots organization in the country who works to depoliticize the climate conversation and bring diverse voices to the table, really. So our Farm Bill advocacy has really focused on climate-smart agriculture and conservation in particular. So that's Title II of the Farm Bill, which we'll get into in a moment. But our advocacy has really been a mixture of grassroots work. So we've had events on the ground where ACC members, young adult members, 18 to 35, are congregating on their college campuses and having conversations there, or they're touring farms and talking to the farming community directly, or they're advocating via op-eds in their local newspapers. And then we've also had a mixture of congressional advocacy, right? So we've done extensive lobbying, and we've published national-based op-eds, had events in DC as well. ACC broadly focuses on solutions first policy, so nature-based climate solutions, amongst quite a few others, have been our main priority. And I'll stop there. I think we can get into the overall Farm Bill conversation now.
Perfect. Yeah, that sounds good. Well, before we dive into where things are currently with the current Farm Bill, would love to take a step back for those of us who are not experts on the Farm Bill, or those like me who hate the Farm Bill. Maybe we'll go back top level and just talk about, the general concept. What is the Farm Bill? What's included? Why is it important? Why do people like me hate it? Why is it so difficult to get passed? That sort of thing. If either of you want to comment, that'd be helpful.
Sure. I can start off. So the Farm Bill is the one piece of legislation that policymakers have to make critical decisions on agricultural policy issues. The Farm Bill was created as part of the New Deal package in response to the Great Depression. So we saw a lot of, at that time, not we, I wasn't alive, but what was happening at that time was that agriculture producers were producing an overabundance of food and creating this pricing crisis for those who couldn't quite afford to purchase the food. And so the Farm Bill created these subsidies for farmers to pay them to reduce production so that they can then sell the food at a fairer price to the American citizens. And so since then, the Farm Bill has really focused on providing subsidies for farmers to be able to feed our country. And over the years, it has expanded from an agriculture title to now include over 12 different titles. Around 1970 is when the conservation title was added to one of those 12 titles, and it was mostly because they saw the production of agriculture to start having impacts on soil erosion in wetlands. And so the Farm Bill was used as a tool to then institute policies and incentivize farmers to do wetland protection as well as address soil and water erosion as a result of their agriculture practices. Sadly enough, but also good, that around the 90s is when forestry was added to the title. So forestry is somewhat the new kid on the block, but it was also added in relation to conservation practices because they saw farmers were not just focused on agriculture, traditional agriculture production, but they also had a large amount of trees on their lands. And so they needed to provide some type of incentives for agriculture producers to then manage their forest lands sustainably in addition to their agriculture production. And so that's when you saw the inclusion of different cost share programs for farmers and ranchers to manage their forest lands. And interesting enough is when the first climate change legislation was introduced. At the time, in 1990 was, I believe the name of it was, let me make sure I'm getting that right, it's a Global Climate Change Prevention Act. So that was the first time the federal government acknowledged that there was some type of climate change issue, and they instituted this act or implemented this act through the Farm Bill to start address climate change. So I think the most recent titles were energy and trade, because we also do trade. A lot of our agriculture productions was also added into the Farm Bill. In this particular administration is the first time that we have heard so much about climate mitigation and climate change. I think under the Obama, the conversation kind of started with different agencies creating climate change offices to start addressing and understanding climate change. And then the Trump administration came in and pulled back some of that, and it's almost like the Biden administration is now catching up for everything that was missed. And so this Farm Bill is a really great opportunity to really address climate change at a very impactful level since 1990.
That was fabulous. This is my first Farm Bill, for everybody's awareness. So if it's your first Farm Bill, cheers to you. Lots to learn. So as I mentioned, ACC has really only plugged into Title II of a dozen titles covering a variety of things. I think a couple points of context as you're going into meetings that are really important to hit home is this is a bill that has to happen every 5 years. However, it did expire at the end of 2023, so we're on a 1-year extension. It's very possible that we have another extension passed this year, just kind of based on how things shake up, but we can talk about that later. The largest pot of money within the titles is within nutrition. So comparatively, conservation and forestry are much smaller dollar amounts. They did receive an influx from IRA, which we'll talk about as well. But just to kind of put into context a little bit more too, the 2018 bill was over $400 billion. So it is a huge price tag. And I would say that's mostly concentrated under nutrition, where also a lot of the sort of like political tension has arisen from. But you had a great explanation, so I don't really have anything to add other than that.
No, I think that was so helpful, and I learned a lot already from this. So I half joked earlier that I hate the Farm Bill, but I did one when I was on the Hill, and the reason I hated it is because it can be incredibly partisan.
Yes.
And the process is just so taxing, as on staff, I'm sure members, but this bill, you know, it touches every single district all across the country, whether you're an ag district where you've got a lot of foresters or ranchers or farmers, or an urban district where you've got a lot of individuals who might be on SNAP or WIC or some of the nutrition programs. It's going to impact everyone's district, so it's relevant to every single member, and so every member really cares about it. And there's a lot of partisan, you know, bickering and fighting about the nuances of the bill. So that being said, can we talk through kind of where it stands currently? Because it seems like we're in one of those partisan kind of standstills. You talked about the extension. What's going on currently, and where do we see this kind of heading?
Take it?
Yeah, I'm happy to start. So if you're following this conversation, you probably saw that a couple weeks ago, a Farm Bill did pass through the House Ag Committee. It was fairly partisan. I will say that there were 4 Dems that did vote, I believe 4, correct me if I'm wrong,
It was 4.
that did vote to pass that forward. But I would say that in terms of this still being sort of a partisan conversation, obviously there is Democratic control of the Senate, and the Senate does have some slightly different priorities across all titles, not just conservation and forestry and climate, which we're talking about today. But ultimately, I think there's a lot of uncertainty on what comes next, right? If this even makes it to the full House floor, or if it makes it to conference, I think that's sort of up for deliberation. But we do have a Farm Bill that was passed out of House Ag, which is progress in itself. So I'll let you add anything else if you.
No, that's good. So yes, to that, House Ag did pass a bill. It's my understanding that the House Democrats are in the process of developing a response to that. So that's going to be a little cat fighting happening there. And then also hearing that the Senate Republicans will release their Farm Bill priorities, which then we'll be able to see with Stabenaus, who is the chair of the Senate Ag Committee, and how it matches up to Bozeman. So I think everything that Morgan has stated is absolutely right. I think we would all need a crystal ball right now to know if we're going to see a farm bill at the end of this Congress. I do believe that the chairman, G.T. Thompson, would really love to see one pass before the end of the Congress, but I'm just not certain that either chamber will be able to resolve their differences in time for that to actually happen.
Yeah, well, I'm going to try to be a little more optimistic than you two maybe and hope, because we do have some momentum, as you said, with the House moving on their bill. The Senate, Democrats have introduced a framework, at least, for their proposal. So yeah, what we're hoping for is there's going to be some sort of agreement coming together on the Farm Bill, and that's why we're advocating for our policy priorities leading up to that. So that way, when there is an agreement, our policies are in there. So diving into more climate policies, what are some of the top things that are out there, either the contentious things, I'm thinking IRA funding, or specific priorities in the forestry title and the conservation title that you think are relevant from a climate perspective in the Farm Bill?
Yeah. I think in both chambers, the biggest challenge will be the IRA climate guardrails. I know some people don't like calling them guardrails, but that's what everyone's calling them. As you will see, I think the Republicans actually came to some type of consensus by even including the IRA dollars and keep maintaining them in the conservation and forestry titles. There was talk initially about just taking the money and putting it into nutrition and other titles, but the fact that they did maintain those IRA dollars in the programs that they were initially given to speaks volumes to, well, not volumes, but speaks to their ability to come to some type of consensus. In the House, they did reduce those guardrails, so there are still some guardrails in place. It is anticipated that the Senate Republicans will remove or request or would like to see all of those climate guardrails removed, which will be quite a deviation from what Stabenow is looking to do, because she wants to maintain all guardrails as included in the IRA. So I think that is going to be the biggest hurdle, the biggest fight, and I think that is where your voices will come into play on tomorrow as you're talking to these offices, really talking about how those IRA dollars are really making an impact on the ground, because I think hearing from you all helps them to make better decisions around this very contentious issue. The other thing in terms of the forestry title, I think there's a good bit of agreement in terms of the other issues. I think both chambers really want to see things like the Good Neighbor Authority. I think all of them realize that there is a nursery capacity issue, and how to address that is of mind. There's several different bills, including the one that you all have been pushing for the past year or so, in addition to the Ringer Act, that all address nursery capacity, that both chambers seem to have a light for. So that's kind of what I see in terms of the conservation forestry title.
Fabulous. Yeah, and just to, I think, provide some additional background on the IRA dollars that we're talking about. So the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022 appropriated about $19.5 billion to conservation. The reason I don't typically refer to them as climate guardrails is because when I talk to Republican congressional offices, when you say guardrails, they sort of see that as a barrier for farmers getting the funding. And in reality, that's not what these program requirements, is what I refer to them as, are doing. They're just a little bit more specific in what you can do with the funding, but USDA is still getting that money out the door. In 2023, I believe 99% of the funds available for that year for these practices were allocated to farmers. So not a barrier there. It is a bit contentious. However, I want to just recognize that it is a big win that that money, whatever is left of that money that hasn't been taken out the door already, is going to Title II conservation practices. So these programs like EQIP and CSP, some of them are working lands programs, and some of them are retirement programs. But ultimately, that money is preserved as of right now, which is a huge win, but ACC, of course, would still like to see that climate language. It's actually, we typically try to refer to it just as emissions mitigation language because that's what the appropriating statute actually describes it as. But yes, that will absolutely be, it's, you know, when they marked up the bill in the House, there were actually, there was a proposed amendment to keep that language there. Ultimately, it failed, so it is still a very contentious point, and I would say a pretty partisan point as well.
Yeah. I would like to just add one thing that is not necessarily a policy challenge that we are facing here, particularly on the House side, but we do have a challenge with the fact that House members don't necessarily vote for farm bills, particularly those that are outside of committee. And there's a rather large new contingency of House representatives. And so even tomorrow, as you're meeting with offices, stressing the importance of the farm bill and that it really touches every single American, and encouraging the congressional members to actually pay attention and vote on the farm bill when it does come time for that.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful to think about how do we frame this message. So before we get into a little bit more policy specifics, just talking about conservation and forestry as a whole, as we're going into these offices, like you said, Maya, talking about the importance of the whole farm bill, but how are we messaging those specific titles or the importance of conservation programs, the importance of these forestry programs, the importance of the climate, policies within the farm bill? How would we message those, maybe specifically to Republican offices versus to a Democratic office? What are some things you think might resonate?
Yeah, I think the bipartisan message that resonates with both Democrats and Republicans, and actually one of the reasons the forestry title was included in the farm bill, is the fact that our rural economies depend upon these programs. As we see mills are closing across the country, that through these programs is literally the only resources and support our forest owners have, and they truly do need. As of right now, the median income for a forest landowner is $50,000. The cost of forest management has increased dramatically, particularly with this recession, or should I say inflation, that we've been experiencing. So our forest landowners, we depend on the programs that Morgan mentioned, the EQIP, the CSP, the CRPs. All of those programs actually are funneled into our rural economies to help bolster those communities that are in critical need of that funding.
I don't know if my slides will work, but I have some data just that, oh, there we go, fabulous. So ACC's approach to this has really been to provide extensive data to these offices on why these programs are so popular and just show them how much their constituents, especially in House Ag, how much their constituents support the programs. So these programs, before the influx of IRA funding, were already intensely oversubscribed. Let me see if I can get there. Sorry, there's some background. So oversubscribed just means that there are consistently more applicants than there's actually funding to give to them. And so you can see on the slide here that in spite of that additional nearly $20 billion, these programs are still intensely oversubscribed. EQIP could fund just 26% of applicants. And so while the conversation has sort of shifted from preserving the dollars for conservation, well, there hasn't been a farm bill signed into law, so I would still obviously hit home that point. And the conversation has shifted over to keeping the climate program requirements. I think it's still very important to note that farmers are highly supportive of these programs across the board, across the country. That money is getting out the door from USDA. So I would hit all of those points home tomorrow in your meetings.
Yeah, and following up on that, Morgan, can you talk about, these programs, we think conservation, we think, okay, it's good for the environment, it's good for conserving, it's good for the climate, but what is the benefit actually to farmers, and how are we, if you're talking to a member of Congress, what do you say is the benefit directly to their farmers or foresters who are their constituents?
There we go, right here. So, for example, you're getting funding to support some sort of, I would describe it more broadly as a sustainable ag practice, and that's benefiting not only your natural environment, but it can also, promote a sustainable sustainable land long term as well. So if you're thinking about the nutrients in your soil, certain practices can support that. You can also make sure that your runoff is not contaminating your water supply. There's just a variety of things here that, of course, they're benefiting the environment, but they're also potentially creating higher yields. And the farming community, of course, is very passionate about making sure they're stewards of the land and that their land is long-term and sustainable, right? Like if it's a family farm, they want it to be continued in the family for a long time. These programs all provide funding to support that idea. Would you like to add anything?
Oh, no.
Okay.
Yeah. I think that's great. And I think, like one of you was saying earlier, it does seem like there's been a shift on the conversation on conservation and on climate as it relates to the Farm Bill and ag policy more broadly, that it seems like both parties are embracing it more. It's becoming more and more of a priority. Would you agree with that? And where do you think kind of some of the bigger opportunities might be in that space? Do you feel like both parties are really moving along on it and we're going to see farm bills that are more reflective of those being top priorities?
Do you want me to go?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I would probably start by just broadly acknowledging that Chairman G.T. Thompson, which is, he represents a very conservative district, has not shied away from talking about climate change, which I want to applaud him for that, right? Like, we can disagree perhaps on where this funding is most impactful, but the fact that he goes on record pretty consistently acknowledging that farmers are critical to solving climate change and are good stewards of the environment, are conservationists, that is very impactful. And I don't think that we really saw that in past farm bills, and I don't really think that we can shy away from that, right? Like, I think that in itself should be considered a huge accomplishment, that the farming community and the ag community more broadly is much more open to talking about climate change and the impacts on farming than we ever have, in my opinion. I think, of course, the Farm Bill is a massive piece of legislation, right? So you're still gonna have disagreement in there, but I think I just wanna kind of applaud that fact and make sure that in our conversations, we're all acknowledging that, but also saying, let's not shy away from continuing this conversation because it's made it a far more productive one this Farm Bill cycle.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with that. I think over this Congress specifically, we have seen, the Democrats and the Republicans actually coming together where it comes to their acknowledgement of climate change. I think in the last Congress, it was the Democrats who were very much so, climate change is real, Republicans really trying to question if it is real. And so now we're all on the same playing field. It's real, it's here, and we need to address it. I think where there's still contention, particularly for the Republican side, is how to address climate change. There are some of them who do not think that natural climate solutions and nature-based solutions are the best pathway forward, and therefore you see a lot of investments being made in renewable energy, which is really great because we definitely do have to address that space because that is the largest contributor to our emissions in greenhouse gas, right? But the natural climate solutions is that bridge. So it takes a while it's going to take us quite some years to really see the outcomes that we would like to see from the renewable energy space. For us to get immediate returns and immediate impacts in climate change, there has to be investments in the natural climate solutions. And so I think that that's where our next political fight is the education of our members on what natural climate solutions are real, legitimizing natural climate solutions as a pathway to addressing our climate change issues.
Well, I think that's a great segue to diving a little bit more into our specific asks, our Lobby Day asks, and thinking through how we're talking about these policies, why are they important. So one of the bills we'll be lobbying on, the Seedlings for Sustainable Habitat Restoration Act. You mentioned a bit before the nursery issue, the issue with making sure we've got enough seedlings coming online so that we can reforest and we can deal with wildfires and things like that. Maya, can you talk a little bit about the importance of that bill, but more broadly, that general funding and the priority of things like seedlings, nurseries, and forestry policy more generally to
Yeah,
address climate.
would love to. So as I mentioned before, the forest title, I did mention that it's more like in response to conservation, and it provides the support for our family forest owners from a private forest land space, but it also does include a lot of legislation that deals with our federal lands. And as we all know, over the years, the intensity of wildfire has increased. And so in this Farm Bill, you're seeing this legislation that really supports us being able to get a handle on our wildfire issue. So one of those issues is the lack of nursery capacity, of which the piece of legislation, which I always forget the name, it's the Seedlings for Sustainable Habitat Act, helps to address that. But it's not just our federal lands that are experiencing that gap. It's also our state forest lands, it's our tribal lands, it's also our private landowners who also need access to nursery capacity. So one of the other acts, the Ringer Act, will be a priority because it also gets at those lands that the Seedling for Sustainable Habitat Act does not address. But it also directs the Forest Service to create a full-time staff that really addresses nursery capacity at all levels: federal, state, tribal, and private nursery capacity. Since I worked for the Forest Service, the Ringer staff has always worked as a collateral duty, and the Ringer Act will now encourage, well, not encourage, but actually enforce the Forest Service to ensure that that staff is now a full-time capacity and puts that capacity in addressing the nursery issue. Some other issues that is one that is priority to me is the Rural Forest Markets Act. As I mentioned, the American Forest Foundation, we create the pathway for family forest owners to enter into the voluntary carbon market. As I mentioned in response to the previous question, is that nature-based solution is that immediate result, and through the voluntary carbon market is how we incentivize family forest owners who are extremely excited about being at the forefront of addressing climate change through their forest management practices. And so many of them want to get in, but it's a very expensive market to enter. And so the Rural Forest Markets Act creates a loan and bond guarantee through USDA that will help to leverage private investments into these rural economies by paying the upfront fees or offsetting the upfront fees for landowners to get into the voluntary carbon market space. And so I think the forestry title will have a good bit of that, the incentivizing of landowners, producers, ranchers to actually make or go the extra effort to do the climate mitigation work. Morgan put up this really great list of conservation practices. USDA has been working very hard at coming up with a different set of practices that are called climate smart practices. And so you'll see in the Farm Bill a number of provisions that really, well, hopefully, if we can keep those practices in place and we can get some agreement, I would hope to see, should I say, that there's more support for those climate mitigating practices, but also into the research to support understanding and really quantifying our greenhouse gas emissions and how to attack that. Also investment into MMRV, which is the measuring, monitoring, I always forget the R. Reporting, thank you, verification, part of these efforts. And so I think that that's as part of what I know we'll see, and then what I hope we'll see once we get some agreement around the IRA and the climate. I can't stop saying guardrails. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Guardrails.
Perfect. And I want to add to that, to your points about the seedlings bill and the forestry policy. I think it's really easy for us to think about it as, you know, if you've got forests in your district, or if you've got forests in your community, or the nurseries are in your community. But we saw last summer, we're starting to see these wildfires just impacting everyone everywhere, with the smoke, you know, drifting all across the country. And the impacts are just devastating on everyone. So I think even though, you know, you might not have these specific nurseries in your district or forests in your district, you can certainly relate to the importance of those policies and a forestry policy generally because of that.
Indeed, and I'll also add that because of climate change, those areas that have traditionally been burning, they'll still be burning, but they're now adding other areas. And because California gets all of the news, we forget to, or we don't take notice that Texas burns every summer, Florida burns every summer. And so these wildfires are popping up in new places every single year. And so just because it's not happening in your place, in your immediate area, doesn't mean that it's not moving in that direction.
Great. And Morgan, I don't know if you want to dive into our other ask, thinking through the increased TSP Access Act, and generally, you know, we're talking about technical service providers, middlemen who allow farmers to access these conservation programs. What's the importance of that? How do we message that to an office, and how can we resonate that message?
Absolutely. So ACC was supportive of this legislation as well. It is bipartisan. Also, I just wanted to add, Maya makes me want to work in forestry, just because all the stuff she's doing is so cool. But I have some numbers that I wanted to just share with you all to speak to the importance of technical service providers. And I would honestly kind of compare this to when I was at DOE, we had infrastructure law funding and IRA funding that came. And it wasn't necessarily a surprise, right? But we didn't have the staff capacity to necessarily get that money out the door as quickly as we would have liked to, right? Federal hiring takes a long time. So I think that this bill in particular really supports federal hiring, specifically at USDA. So a number that I pulled up is last year USDA projected that in order to implement the conservation funding, they were going to need to hire between 3,000 and 4,000 employees over the next several years. So that's a high volume of folks. And so this doesn't necessarily make it so you're just hiring federal employees. Technical service providers can be third-party practitioners that are also supporting with technical assistance for implementing these conservation practices on farmland, essentially. So they're critical to implementing all of this additional funding that the IRA appropriated to conservation and just overall increasing USDA's bandwidth.
Perfect. And we're going to turn to audience questions in just a minute, so hopefully there should have been some cards going around, so feel free, raise your hand if you need one, but jot those questions down for us. But I'll kick it off with one, last one, and then hopefully we'll transition to audience questions. As we're starting these conversations with the members, you know, we've talked about the conservation pieces, the forestry pieces, the nutrition pieces, all of this. What should we be looking for as we're doing our lobby meeting preps to figure out what aspects of the Farm Bill are relevant to this member? How do you start those conversations? Especially I'm thinking members who aren't, you know, from a super rural district, and you can easily talk about farms. How do you start those conversations, and where do we kind of figure out what's a good opening point?
That's a really great question. And the best way to start the conversation is just asking. So asking the staffer, what's important to your member? What's important about nutrition to your member? They may not have forests, they may not have a high population of agriculture, but there's not any member that represents any constituency base that does not include folks that participate in nutrition programs. And if that's where you have to start, then that's where you start, because nutrition programs are funded by what? The food is provided for those nutrition programs by who? Our farmers and our ranchers. And so that's the way that you make the connection. So if they only are familiar with SNAP participants or food banks in their area, it's our farmers that provide the food for those food banks. It's our farmers that provide the food to the grocery stores that their SNAP recipients qualify for. It's our farmers that provide and ranchers that provide the milk that qualifies under WIC. It's also our farmers that provide the food to the school nutrition programs to feed the children that are on free and reduced lunch. And so you kind of just start off asking the staffer exactly what is the constituent base, what's important to that member. And agriculture touches every single one of our homes because we eat every day. We have to eat to live. And so I think just focusing on that basic need and looping it back to your priorities is one way to start that conversation.
And that was such a great answer. I don't have much to add. I mean, I would recommend, since you likely know who you're meeting with, just doing your homework in terms of like what their district looks like, if they've been the sponsor of any bills that have actually like gone through in the past version in the House, for example. But ultimately, I would recognize that the Farm Bill touches everybody in this country. And I would also recognize that this is always a really complicated piece of legislation because there are truly so many varying interests. Obviously, it's all food and ag, and now conservation and forestry and climate. But realistically, there are so many different aspects, and everybody, I think, is doing their best to balance those out, right? But this has a huge dollar amount associated with it. So it can obviously be, I've obviously had conversations that have been somewhat frustrating in terms of the conservation funding is quite a bit smaller than anything else, but I have to recognize that that's a piece that some folks see as being more beneficial elsewhere, right? So your job, I think, is to hit home that these programs are extremely important, this funding is extremely important, and it is very impactful to the long-term sustainability of farming in America as well, and kind of making the case there. But recognizing that there are so many competing interests is very important.
Awesome. All right. Well, I think we can kick it over to some audience questions if we've got some in the back.
Yes, we do have some questions back here. Let's see. Can you discuss any impacts of the Farm Bill on urban forests?
Yes, I can. So in this Farm Bill, both the House and Senate versions will include $80 million for the Urban and Community Forestry Program, and also implement that program as a standalone office. Currently, the Urban and Community Forest Program sits under the Cooperative Forestry Programs at the Forest Service, and it's actually just one of the programs in a larger suite of forest landowner support programs. So this Farm Bill, will actually create this as a standalone and put $80 million, which is quite an increase in authorization. Previously, the program was authorized at $40 million, so it almost doubles its authority over the next Farm Bill. It also increases and puts an emphasis on urban research to really understand how climate change is impacting our urban hubs. And I do believe there's one, and I probably shouldn't mention this because I'm not quite sure, but I do believe there's a piece of legislation that is going to provide support for smaller forest landowners in urban areas entering into markets such as voluntary carbon markets.
And then we have a couple questions about technical service providers. Can you say a little bit more about what they are exactly and what do they do exactly?
Yeah, I can kick that off for us. So yeah, technical service providers, TSPs, are essentially a individual who is trained and certified in the conservation programs and the conservation title. So they're trained in all the different sort of grants, policies, programs that farmers, ranchers, and foresters can have access to. With that certification and that knowledge, what they do is they work with individual farmers, ranchers, and foresters to help them access those programs. So as you can imagine, I'm sure there's a lot of farmers, foresters, and ranchers who, it's not in their experience, nor is it in their probably daily time allotment to search through all of these different USDA programs and figure out which ones they qualify for, which ones might benefit their operations. So these TSPs help them have access to those programs and make sure that they're allowed to get the funding, help them apply for it, help them figure out which ones are beneficial to their specific operations. And I'll note, larger operations, so if you think of big, corporate farming operations, they typically have someone in-house who's able to get them access to these programs. They hire someone who's familiar, who's read all of the different, federal laws, who knows the last Farm Bill in and out, and they give them access. So TSPs are really critical for small and middle-sized farms who don't have the money to hire someone in-house to do that, and they use these TSPs to get them access to this critical funding. That's not only obviously good for the climate, good for conservation, but it's ultimately good for their own operations. I don't know if you want to.
And I can actually share a real life story. We just had one of our forest owners who participated in one of our lobbying days to share how our TSP helped them to reduce the time that they spent looking and researching USDA programs, and not only just looking and researching, but actually applying for these programs can be extremely difficult to navigate. There's a lot of nuances, there's a lot of paperwork. So this landowner started on the journey of just applying for the farm and tract number. If any farmer, rancher, forest landowner participates in any USDA program, they must first have a farm and tract number placed or attached to their land. The TSP hand walked this landowner, who was a first-time landowner. They just purchased a 15-acre forest lot in upstate New York. They coming from corporate America, they really have no idea what to do with this. It was literally the TSP that helped them to navigate all of these systems and reduced their, I think initially before meeting the TSP, they had spent like 6-7 months just trying to get a farm and tract number. As soon as he met the TSP, that time was reduced to like 4 weeks. And then from there, just the TSP started to look at their land, sending them different programs that they can qualify, and not just what they qualify, but they help them to legally stack the different programs to meet their personal goals. That is the role of a TSP. And right now there's a shortage of those because it took this landowner almost 6 or 7 months to get in with this TSP. Just imagine, as Morgan mentioned, with the IRA funds, there's such an influx of new landowners because the IRA funds, one of the goals is to bring new forest owners, new producers into the USDA system. So those landowners too don't have the farm and tract number. Those landowners also don't understand the USDA programs and how to navigate that. And so needing additional TSPs to navigate those systems, it's essential. There are some landowners who would never access the USDA system without these individuals.
And I would just add, if you're bored in your hotel room tonight, you can go on the USDA. NRCS is actually the entity that's implementing most of these conservation funds, but you can really see the process on their website, and you can kind of, I think, gaze at this through the lens of someone who was actually applying for the funds, which I did early on when I started talking about these programs, and I think is quite helpful to bring some context into like just the importance of someone being a technical expert and supporting the implementation of the dollars.
Thank you, Morgan. This question is for you. Is the ACC working with the Farm Bureau to build support for sustainable agriculture? This question comes from someone in North Carolina who notices that the local farm bureaus are skeptical of sustainable agriculture.
So ACC, I think the question was, has ACC worked with the Farm Bureau? Is that correct? Yeah, okay. We actually did a lunch and learn with the Farm Bureau on the Hill. The Farm Bureau is, I think, takes less of an advocacy stance on a lot of these issues at the federal level. However, is extremely supportive of the conservation programs because they're definitely advocates for the farming community, which benefits heavily from conservation programs that have been housed at USDA for years. So we have worked with the Farm Bureau primarily. I primarily work at the federal level, so the American Farm Bureau Federation's DC team is who we did a joint lunch and learn with on the Hill, where we actually went in to talk to Hill staffers. The Farm Bureau obviously has a lot more technical expertise and can speak to the practices firsthand. And how they benefit farmers firsthand because they have those real life stories. But we did a lunch and learn with congressional staff to speak to specifically the conservation programs at USDA. So we're working with them primarily at the federal level, of course, sometimes on the ground here and there as well.
I'll just add on the Farm Bureau piece. I agree with you. When I was on the Hill, the National Farm Bureau definitely has some policy positions, but the states vary widely in their individual Farm Bureau positions. So if you do have a member who represents a pretty rural or agricultural district, that's a great group to talk to and try to build that relationship with your state Farm Bureau if there's local individuals, because you'll get some good insight on what local farmers are really prioritizing, talking to that either state group or some of the local members. And then having that connection can help you as you go into your member's office. I'm talking in future years, if you have an ag member, you know, being able to have that connection with that state chapter of the Farm Bureau can be super helpful, and having more to talk about and more to relate on, and obviously more prepared on what the member's going to be hearing about.
Thank you. Can any of you speak to what percentage of our food supply is at risk due to climate change?
Not specifically.
Yeah, we did not get a nutrition or food supply expert on this panel, so yeah, I don't think we have a clear answer on that one.
All right.
We could maybe Google it.
Right.
Which farm organizations are advocating for the TSP Access Act?
Yeah, there's a good list online. I don't have it in front of me, but we've got our one-pager which lists it, and then the offices who have put the bill out there also have their own one-pagers, so feel free to do a quick Google search of the bill, and that should pull up the one-pager from the congressional offices who have introduced it, and that will list the different farm organizations, the national organizations, I'll say. If you're interested in your specific state, you could always do a Google of the bill with your state name, because I know some state chapters of different farm organizations have also endorsed. They might not be listed on those national letters of support that you would find, but a Google search should pull some of those up.
Thank you. Is there significant funding needed to hire the TSPs that we need, and is that at all problematic?
Yeah, so there definitely was an increase in the last farm bill, and we've seen some additional increases along the way, but that is a piece of this as well, is we do need more funding for TSPs. Right now, the higher priority is that we need more people. There's funding coming because of those recent bills that have passed, the last farm bill, but we need the policy in place and the process to get those TSPs certified. So that's why the increased TSP Access Act is dealing with the certification process of these TSPs. Obviously, the government needs money for these TSPs. We need people to want to be certified, but there's not enough certifiers of these TSPs. So the increased TSP Access Act deals with that certification process and makes sure that the federal government comes up with a streamlined certification process of third-party providers, they call them. So making sure that it doesn't have to be a federal employee who can do this sort of certification. So yeah, funding is definitely one piece of it, but a smaller piece because we've seen the funding increase along the way. So now the bigger problem is making sure people are in the pipeline, and then making sure that pipeline is really streamlined and quick to get them through and get them certified.
And Jen, wasn't this included in the House version? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it was bipartisan, yeah.
Yes, yeah. So the increased TSP Access Act has been included in the House Republican farm bill that passed out of committee and was supported on a bipartisan basis. So I think in large credit to a lot of work you guys did in November lobbying on it. We got a good co-sponsor list on this bill already, and it's already moved some. We definitely need to get a few more co-sponsors on it so that we can keep it at the top of the list, especially should the Senate introduce their bill. We want to make sure we get it included there as well.
Is there anything in the Farm Bill that supports aquatic forests, such as mangroves and kelp forests for coastal states?
I can't say. I have not quite been tracking that. I do. Yeah, I'll be safe and leave it there.
Yeah, I do know there are some pots of funding. I think they're small and few and far between, because there are separate bills, larger bills, that are specifically devoted to that, but there are some streams of funding that can go to it. It's not going to individuals the same way the conservation title goes to individuals, but more funding that some states get through these larger pots that allow them to take care of their mangroves and things like that. It's definitely not a big portion of the bill, though, but if your member is particularly concerned about that, or that's a big thing in your district, it could be worth a little bit of digging to pull that out there.
Is there anything in the Farm Bill that helps to subsidize fresh vegetables, for example, so that you could buy potatoes less expensively than potato chips?
Well, I think there's a number of nutrition programs. I'll talk about going back to my Farm Bill days. There's a bunch of nutrition programs to support increasing access to fresh produce. There's a lot of nutrition programs that operate on a local level. So thinking of things, generally farm to table, but farm to food bank. So programs that allow farmers to be compensated for their produce at a higher rate than they might if they just bulk sold it to, a corporation or something. So they're compensated at a higher rate to sell that to local food banks, local pantries, local, food organizations that need that food. So there are definitely programs within the bill. Those are pretty much all, I think, in the nutrition title. And those monies would flow to farmers to make sure that their food is ending up in these nutrition programs. And nutrition programs are not buying from large operations, but instead can get their food more locally, hopefully avoiding some of that processed food.
We have time for just one last question and then any final thoughts. A high school student is wondering, besides lobbying, what else can I do to help pass the Farm Bill?
Write an op-ed. I would say, first of all, advocacy starts from the ground up. So even if you're lobbying your members of Congress, which I'm so happy you're all here, that's fabulous, you should do that. Your local elected officials also care deeply about the Farm Bill passing too, and sometimes there's strength in numbers, right? So ACC is a grassroots organization. We've done a lot of work in communities through writing op-eds, organizing events, talking to local elected officials, and they can also carry that message all the way to the top, right? So you're in DC, your state ag commissioner also comes to DC and talks about the importance of the Farm Bill. So presenting a unified front, and I think making the conversation very locally driven as well is critical.
Yep. I double emphasize that most of the congressional offices do not take my word on whether or not to support the bill. They take the word of local organizations. So writing your local organizations and telling them the importance and having conversations with your federal representatives is critically important, because that's literally the reason why they endorse these bills, is because their local constituents are telling them the impact that it will have on them.
Perfect.
Thank you. Can we get a warm round of applause for our panel?